Welcome back to Chapter 14. This is the second lecture video where we're just going to keep working through the sales variances and get to the additional components, mainly sales quantity variance and its two components, market share and market size variances. So just another recap. These we went over in the last lecture series. Then in the last video of this lecture series, we calculated sales volume variance, and then went through and talked about the concepts and the meaning of sales mix variance. So now we're going to break down the other side of the sales volume variance and look at the sales quantity variance. So sales quantity variance just says the variance due to sales quantity. It's pretty straightforward, especially when you look at the calculation. It's all units of all products sold minus the budgeted unit or total sales of all products, right? So this isn't at an individual, this part of the equation isn't at an individual product line. This is all products. And then we would incorporate the sales mix percentage and the contribution margin percentage of each product. And again, we do this calculation for all our products and sum it up. But for our purposes, we just want to look high level at what sales quantity variance means. And the easiest way to think about this is sales quantity variance is the overall dollar value of the difference between actual and budgeted amount of sales. That overall, we sold more or less than we anticipated. And what's the dollar value on that change in quantity? So this one's a little more straightforward. So let's go back one and let's break down this equation. The sales mix, this is always going to be a positive number. Contribution margin, hopefully this should always be a positive number. And so the only thing that would make a favorable or unfavorable change in sales quantity variance would just be if we sold more or less overall goods than anticipated. So if our actuals, here's our actuals and our budgeted, if our actuals are greater than budgeted, then this is positive, and this is positive. So it's each one of our products is going to be favorable. But if our actuals are less than budgeted, then this will be negative, this will be positive, this will be positive. So for every single one of our products will have an unfavorable variance. And so let's see that in action. At an individual product level, you'll have a favorable variance anytime your overall sales are greater than budgeted. Not just this product, but all products. So at the aggregate level, all it does is value the overall amount of that favorable or unfavorable attributable to each product. So if your change in quantity, say your actual is 10 and your budgeted is 5. So we know that overall, we have 5 units favorable. So at an aggregate level, if these 5 units are comprised of our highest contribution margin products, well, we'll have a pretty high favorable variance. If these 5 units are comprised of almost entirely our very low level contribution margin products, well, then we'll have a very low favorable variance. So don't worry about all of that. Just know that at the individual product level, you'll have favorable variances anytime your actuals are greater than budget. At the aggregate level, same thing. You'll have favorables anytime your actuals are greater than budget. But the aggregate level will just change based on some of the properties of each product. So that's basically it. Sales quantity. All we need to know is that when you sell more, your actuals are greater than budgeted, you should get a favorable variance. And this favorable variance will be greater if depending on the budgeted makeup of your products. If you had planned on almost all of these products being your high contribution margin, then this favorable should be greater than if the majority of your sales were going to be from a low contribution margin product. So it's pretty straightforward. So now let's break this down into market size and market share variances. So market size variance, for this, let's not worry about any of this for now. All we need to know is market size variance says, hey, did the market size for all of our products go up or down? If market size went up, we'll have a positive variance. And the greater the market size grew, the more favorable the variance. It's pretty straightforward, right? If we're Apple and all of a sudden the market for iPads, or not just iPads, but the market for tablets and cell phones, if those go crazy, then we're likely to have a favorable market size variance. So now let's look at market share. It's basically the same ideas. Not worrying about the calculation. It just says if we captured more of the market, then we should have a favorable variance. Assuming the size of the market stayed the same and our market share grew, we're Apple. We took over from Samsung and BlackBerry, and we took a lot of that market share. Well, we should have a favorable market share variance. So we just went over that. Market size, we should be favorable, assuming our market share stays the same. If the market grew in size, we should have a favorable variance. Market share says, assuming the market size stayed the same, if our market share grew, we should have a favorable variance. But what's interesting is the interaction of these two. So a lot of times, you might not know the market share or the market size, right? A lot of this information is hard to come by. Sometimes you can look at all the company's 10Ks and add up a lot of information, or there might be some research reports that do this. But a lot of time there's private companies that don't report. And so whatever your product is, it's hard to capture both of these. But assume that, right, because we know our sales quantity variance is our market size plus our market share variance. So assume that we knew our market quantity variance was positive. Market quantity variance was positive, right? We did those calculations. We know that's positive. If we see evidence out there that the market size, say, went down, so we know that market size, we should have an unfavorable variance because overall people aren't buying our type of product. Well, then we could look at this formula and we know, well, if our sales quantity variance went up, we had a positive variance, but our market size was unfavorable. That means our market share variance must have went up. We must have, even though the market size shrank overall, we must have captured a lot of that market share to still have a sales quantity positive or favorable variance. So it's just an interesting interaction here. And it's worth noting because a lot of times you won't know both of these. You won't have all the information to calculate these. So you can really use your sales quantity variance, which you can calculate, and then maybe some reports or analyst information to help you back in to one of these variances. Just something good to know, and I'd make sure you understand how all three of these pieces of this equation relate to each other. And it's really just this right here. Because we know that market size plus market share adds up to our sales quantity variance. So just to summarize, we went over these in our last chapter lectures. In our last lecture of this chapter, we talked about sales volume variance and sales mix variance. And then today we went over conceptually what it means to have sales quantity variance and when would we expect those to be positive. And then the same with market share and market size. What do those variances mean, and when would we expect those to be positive? And then briefly chatted about the relationship of these three items and some of the information we can glean from those just knowing 2 out of the 3. So here's your question for this lecture. So it's the same information from the Baskin-Robbins case, but in the last lecture, we worked on 1. In the last lecture, we focused on the sales mix variance. But this time, your practice problem is the sales quantity variance. So kind of do the same thing. Look at these changes in sales quantities and try to see what you think, if it'd be favorable or unfavorable, and why. And again, the solutions for 1, 2A that we used in the last lecture, and this 2B, all these will be posted on the slides on Canvas. So that's it for these lectures. We kind of worked our way through that sales volume variance hierarchy all the way down to these market size and share variances. In the next lecture, we're going to briefly talk about customer profitability analyses. There's not a lot there, but it's definitely some important stuff that's worth noting. So I'm excited to see you guys then, and hopefully you're enjoying the series so far.